Everyone had something to say about your life, your choices, your timing, your pace. They all thought they knew better, thought their voice should matter more than your silence. Advice came from mouths that never asked if you were okay. Opinions flooded your space like noise you couldn't shut off. They told you to move faster, then slower, be tougher, then softer, speak more, then stay quiet. They never agreed, but they all spoke like their words were gospel. And somehow, you started listening. You wanted to be good. You wanted to be understood. So you shifted. You tried to adjust. You swallowed your instincts and wore masks that didn't fit. You changed your tone, your style, your pace. You said yes when your body screamed no. You ignored your gut. You wanted their approval more than you trusted your own voice. And slowly, without realizing it, you lost yourself trying to keep them comfortable. The noise wasn't just from strangers. It came from people close to you, people you thought would support you. They questioned your plans with smiles on their faces. They doubted your vision while claiming to cheer you on. They disguised judgment as advice. You heard it in their tone, in the way they tilted their heads when you spoke. You felt small after talking to them, but you kept listening, because love can sound like criticism when it's tainted by control. You started living for reaction, for acceptance. You measured your worth by how quiet the room got when you succeeded. You told yourself, if they approve, then you must be doing something right. But you forgot how it felt to be alone with your own thoughts. You forgot what your voice even sounded like, without the background noise of everyone else's expectations. It wasn't just overwhelming, it was suffocating. You stopped writing like yourself, speaking like yourself, thinking like yourself. You became a version of you that never felt right, but looked right to them. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You performed happiness. You walked through rooms filled with noise, and no one saw the tension in your jaw, the exhaustion in your eyes, because you were playing a role. And roles don't get asked how they feel. They just perform. And the worst part, no one stayed when the show ended. When you broke, the room emptied. The voices went quiet. Suddenly the people who had so much to say had nothing. No calls, no messages, no help. They weren't there to hold the pieces. They were only there when you looked put together, when you were doing well enough to make them feel inspired, but not broken enough to make them uncomfortable. Your silence didn't serve them, so they walked away. That's when you realized the noise never cared about your peace. It only cared about access. Your openness was convenience for them. Your softness was a service. Your vulnerability was something they consumed like content. And when it no longer entertained them, they left. You weren't interesting when you were healing. You weren't loud enough to stay relevant. Your stillness scared them. So you sat with yourself, alone, for the first time in a long time. And it wasn't peaceful. It was chaotic in a different way. The silence was heavy. It echoed with voices you tried to forget. You replayed conversations, criticism, manipulation disguised as love. You heard every time you were told to be someone else, and you felt every time you listened, but you didn't run from it. You didn't numb it. You stayed. You started asking hard questions, not to others, to yourself. Who are you without their voices in your head? What do you want when no one else is watching? What hurts that you haven't acknowledged yet? You didn't answer all at once. You just sat there, letting the noise fade, letting your system detox, letting your nervous system calm after years of performing under pressure. And with that stillness came clarity. You weren't broken by life. You were broken by noise. Constant, never-ending, opinion-heavy noise. and none of it fed your soul. It only drowned your truth. Every time you swallowed your thoughts to please someone else, you chipped away at yourself. Every compromise, every fake smile, every "I'm fine" when you weren't. That's what cracked you. Not weakness, not failure, just noise. But now, you hear the silence differently. It's not empty, it's not cold, it's honest. You can hear your thoughts again. You don't jump when your phone buzzes. You don't flinch when people question your path, because now their volume doesn't control your direction. You turned it down, not out of hate, out of survival. You started picking up the pieces, not with urgency, with patience. One quiet moment at a time. You realized healing isn't loud, growth isn't loud. Real change happens in rooms no one else sees. And your silence? It wasn't weakness. It was space. Space for you to return to yourself, to meet yourself without noise, without pressure, without the demand to perform. And now, when people speak, you listen differently. You don't absorb everything. You filter. You don't react. You observe. You're not cold. You're aware. You don't need the noise to feel validated anymore. You've heard enough. Now it's your turn to speak. Only when it matters. Not to prove. Just to exist. Fully. You didn't tell anyone you were leaving. You didn't write some long post. You didn't owe anyone that. One day, you just stopped answering. You stopped explaining your silence. You stopped picking up the phone for people who only called when they needed something. You didn't say goodbye. You just disappeared. And not because you were angry, but because you were done breaking yourself to stay visible. You were exhausted, not just tired, not just drained. It was a kind of fatigue that didn't sleep away. It followed you, sat on your chest, lingered in your thoughts. Every conversation started to feel heavy. Every room felt loud. Every interaction chipped away at the little piece you had left. You knew something had to change, but saying it out loud didn't feel right. So, you chose silence. You chose distance. At first, it didn't feel powerful. It felt strange. You were used to being available, used to replying fast, showing up fast, saying yes even when it hurt. Your absence felt like guilt, like betrayal. But that feeling didn't last long, because slowly, clarity replaced it, and you realized disappearing wasn't betrayal. It was protection. People didn't notice right away. That's what hurt the most. You thought your presence mattered more than it did. But when you went quiet, nothing happened. Days passed. No one checked in. No one asked where you went. They kept posting, kept living, kept going. It hit you hard. You were supporting people who didn't even think twice about your silence. That realization broke you in a quiet way. Not with screaming, but with silence that echoed. There's something about disappearing that reveals everything. Who misses you? Who reaches out? Who noticed you were the glue? You start seeing the roles you played. You start remembering all the times you saved conversations, all the moments you kept relationships alive, all the times you stayed on the call just so they wouldn't feel alone. When you disappeared, so did the connection, because you were the connection. You didn't go silent to get attention. That's never been your thing. You don't play games. You don't do petty. You went silent because the noise was too much. The fake smiles, the forced energy, the draining people. You were spreading yourself so thin, there was nothing left for you. And one day, you woke up and realized you couldn't keep showing up for people who disappear when you need them. So you stopped, quietly. No drama, no closure. Just a quiet exit. You took your energy back, your time, your kindness. You stopped updating people who never checked in. You stopped being available for people who only saw you as useful. And the moment you did, You noticed who only wanted you when it was easy, who only loved you when you were convenient. You weren't trying to punish anyone. You weren't angry. You were just empty. And sometimes the only way to refill yourself is to disappear from everything that drains you. So you pulled back. You logged out. You muted chats. You ignored texts. And with each quiet step back, you felt lighter, not healed, but breathing again. They'll say you changed, that you went cold, that you're distant, but they won't talk about how much you gave, how much you tolerated, how many times you swallowed your pain just to keep the peace. They won't mention the way you held everyone else together while falling apart, because they didn't see it, or maybe they didn't want to. You started to learn how loud silence can be. It speaks volumes. It reveals more than words ever could. People hate it because they can't control it. They can't twist your silence, can't argue with it, can't guilt you through it. And that's where your power started, in not responding, in not explaining, in not justifying your absence to those who never appreciated your presence. There's a different kind of peace that comes from detachment, from no longer needing to be seen to feel real. You stopped performing your pain, stopped advertising your loyalty. You don't need people to clap for your healing. You just needed space. Space to breathe, to think, to hear yourself again. Because your own voice had gotten lost in the noise of constantly showing up for others. It was strange at first, sitting with yourself, no distractions, no new messages, no replies waiting, just your own mind. But slowly, it became grounding. You started listening to what your body was telling you, what your heart had been screaming, and it said, stop, rest, walk away. Some people got offended. They thought your silence was about them. It wasn't. It was about you, about what you could no longer carry, what you could no longer fake. You didn't leave to teach them a lesson. You left to protect your sanity, to protect what was left of your peace. And if they couldn't understand that, they were never meant to stay. Disappearing isn't dramatic when it's about survival. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pull away without saying a word. No explanation, no message, just absence. Let them feel the silence. Let them wonder. Let them face the version of themselves that only showed up when it was convenient. Because you've done your part. You've played every role. The listener, the comforter, the giver, the fixer. But now, you choose quiet. You choose healing. You choose peace. And if that means disappearing without warning, so be it. You're not lost. You're just finally choosing yourself. You didn't slam the door. You didn't post a goodbye. You didn't even explain. You just stopped, quietly, slowly, without warning, without drama. One day you were there, showing up, responding, holding space. The next day, you weren't. It wasn't out of spite. It was survival. You couldn't keep bleeding for people who never noticed the wound. So you disappeared. Not for attention, for air. You realized no one was listening. Not really. They only heard you when it was convenient, when your words made them feel better. But when you were tired, when you needed something back, their silence was louder than your pain. You started wondering what would happen if you stopped showing up, if you stopped initiating, if you stopped being the one to keep things alive. So you tested it, and it broke you, because no one noticed. Not at first, not until your absence became inconvenient. There's a strange pain in realizing your presence was never valued, just expected. You were dependable, predictable, always there. So they assumed you always would be. They took your loyalty as something owed, not something given. So you stopped giving it. You didn't make a scene. You didn't tell them what they lost. You just stopped offering what they never appreciated. People say silence is powerful, but they don't tell you how hard it is at first, how isolating it feels, how it eats at you in the beginning. You're used to noise, used to being needed, even when it drained you, even when it killed your peace. The silence felt cold at first. It felt like failure, like you gave up, like you were vanishing. But in truth, you were returning to yourself, to stillness, to something real. You noticed how fast the messages stopped, how the phone stayed quiet, how the people who swore they cared went missing the second you stopped serving them. It stung. You checked your phone more than you want to admit, waiting, hoping, but the silence stayed, and eventually you stopped hoping, not out of bitterness, out of acceptance, because silence shows you who's real, who checks in when you have nothing to offer, who sees you even when you're not shining. You weren't trying to prove a point. You were trying to breathe. You spent so long overextending, over-explaining, over-giving. You were tired of being the only one showing up, tired of being everything for people who were nothing when it mattered. So you vanished, quietly, and watched who came looking. Most didn't. That truth sat heavy in your chest. But at least it was honest, and honesty is better than pretty lies. People started to notice eventually. A few asked where you'd been, not with concern but curiosity, as if your silence disrupted their pattern, as if your absence created inconvenience. They didn't ask how you were, just why you stopped being useful. It was then you realized how transactional most relationships are. Love shouldn't be earned through exhaustion. Presence shouldn't be conditional on performance. You began to understand the cost of constantly being available. You were always the one fixing, saving, supporting, but no one was ever there when your world was on fire. You gave emotional CPR to people who watched you flatline, and still, they wondered why you left, why you changed, as if your silence was an overreaction, as if they weren't the reason for it. You didn't leave in anger, you left in pain, and that's what they'll never understand. You didn't cut them off. You just stopped shrinking yourself to be digestible. You stopped silencing your own needs, stopped pretending their bare minimum was enough. You realized your worth didn't depend on how much you could endure, and so you withdrew, not to punish, but to protect. They say silence speaks volumes, but the hardest part is when you're the only one hearing it, when the quiet makes your doubts scream, when your own mind becomes louder than the world you left, but you stayed in it. You resisted the urge to go back, to explain, to reach out. You let the space grow. You let yourself be missed, or not. Either way, you didn't return, and in that silence, something shifted. You stopped overthinking, stopped checking who watched your stories, stopped worrying if they were talking about you, because it didn't matter anymore. You were too focused on healing to care, too focused on peace to seek revenge. You weren't plotting, you were resting, rebuilding, refusing to participate in your own exhaustion. The silence taught you that peace isn't found in noise. It's found in absence, in choosing yourself when no one else does, in walking away from what feels familiar but leaves you empty. It taught you that disappearing doesn't make you weak. It makes you aware of your limits, aware of who drains you, aware of who pretends. Some people didn't even notice you left. That was the final confirmation. You weren't important to them, just convenient. And now that convenience was gone. So was their attention. But the people meant for you. They'll feel your absence. They'll remember your presence. They'll reach out when the room gets quiet. You don't need many, just real ones. You still miss some of them, not for who they are now, but for who you thought they were. You still wonder what it could have been like if they matched your effort. But you don't chase anymore. You've made peace with the silence. You've learned to sit with it. Let it teach. Let it clean out the noise. You're not running back. You're moving forward. And maybe one day they'll look around and notice your silence and realize it wasn't weakness. It was a decision, a hard one, but the right one. You didn't say goodbye. You didn't warn anyone. One day you just stopped showing up. No dramatic exit, no last words. You vanished from places you used to light up, stopped replying, stopped explaining. People noticed, but not enough to ask why. They assumed you were just being distant, maybe moody, maybe overwhelmed. But the truth was quieter. You were tired of giving, of being seen and never understood, of pouring into connections that never poured back. It wasn't a choice made out of anger. It was one made out of exhaustion. You started disappearing long before they noticed, piece by piece. First emotionally, then mentally, then physically. The version of you that used to initiate everything, the calls, the check-ins, the support, went silent. You waited to see who would notice, who would reach out first, who would care without being asked to. Most didn't. And that silence told you everything. You used to be the one holding things together. Relationships, conversations, energy in the room. You were the consistent one, the dependable one, the soft place to land. But that role came with a cost. No one ever asked how much it was draining you. They just kept showing up empty, expecting you to fill them. And you did, until you couldn't. There comes a point where staying available feels like betrayal. Not to them, to yourself. You knew you were losing pieces of yourself by staying too accessible. You knew you were being overlooked, used, or worse, taken for granted. But you kept doing it, out of love, out of habit, until the silence inside you started screaming louder than the connections around you. So you left, not with anger, with clarity. You stopped posting, stopped updating, stopped trying to stay relevant in their world. You weren't seeking attention, you were seeking air. You needed to breathe again, to hear your own thoughts without interference, to sit with yourself, undistracted. That kind of silence is uncomfortable. It brings everything to the surface. Things you buried to keep the peace. Feelings you silenced to be likable. In your silence, you met parts of yourself you forgot existed. The part that wanted more. The part that was tired of being the only one who showed up with real effort. You didn't need noise. You needed space. So you created it. You pulled back so you could come back stronger. But no one saw it that way. They said you were being distant, that you were changing, that you were cold now. They didn't realize you weren't changing. You were returning, back to your own center, back to your own priorities. Their access wasn't revoked out of spite. It expired because they didn't value it. You were always there when it mattered. And when you stopped being convenient, they stopped being present. That was the wake-up call. That was the proof. You don't blame them. People aren't used to consistency walking away. They expect you to stay, even when it hurts. But you reached your limit. There's a quiet strength in walking away without announcing it. In choosing yourself, not to prove a point, but to preserve your sanity. It's easy to confuse silence with weakness. Easy to label someone as cold when they stop explaining themselves. But silence isn't passive. It's powerful. It's controlled. It's an act of resistance. You didn't stop caring. You stopped wasting your care where it wasn't respected. You didn't stop loving. You stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. And yes, they noticed. The shift was obvious. The people who once took your presence for granted began to feel your absence. The texts became more spaced out. The calls never came. You didn't chase them. You didn't remind them what they were losing. You let them experience it. That's how they learn, not through arguments or essays, but through distance, through emptiness. You weren't trying to punish anyone. You just stopped breaking yourself into pieces to keep connections alive. If silence is what it took to protect your peace, then silence became your answer. Some people can only hear you when you stop talking. Some only value your time when it's no longer theirs. You started choosing peace over presence. You prioritized solitude over shallow conversations. You learned that not all silence is empty. Sometimes it's where your power lives, where your healing begins, where you regain the voice that was drowned out by everyone else's expectations. In the past, you'd feel guilty for pulling away. You'd second-guess yourself, worry if they thought you changed. Now, you're fine with being misunderstood. You don't need everyone to get it. You just need to be real with yourself. You owe that to the version of you who always put others first. You're not bitter. You're not hiding. You're growing in private. You don't need a crowd for that. You don't need applause. You just need space. You realized your value in the silence. You realized who really cares when you stop showing up for everyone else and finally show up for yourself. They thought your silence meant you were done, that you were lost. But you weren't lost. You were learning how to pour into yourself first, learning how to stop chasing people who never stayed, learning how to sit with the discomfort of quiet without running back to the noise. The version of you that disappeared. They weren't escaping, they were preparing. And that silence, that wasn't weakness. That was the sound of someone finally listening to their own voice. You didn't tell anyone you were leaving. You didn't announce it. No emotional goodbye, no dramatic post. You just stopped showing up. One day you were there, present, giving, reachable. The next you were just gone. No conflict, no closure, just silence. People noticed, but not in the way you thought they would. They didn't ask why. They didn't reach out. They assumed, made up stories, told themselves lies to protect their own guilt. You let them. You knew what would happen. The moment you stopped being available, someone would call you selfish, cold, distant. They'd act like you were the one who changed for no reason. But you know the truth. You didn't leave out of nowhere. You left after years of being unseen, after being there for people who only noticed your absence, never your presence, after holding space for everyone else and getting nothing in return. You disappeared because staying visible was making you invisible to yourself. You stopped chasing conversation, stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, stopped apologizing for your silence. It wasn't anger. It was self-preservation. You couldn't afford to keep showing up for people who couldn't even remember the last time they checked in. You didn't ghost them. They left first. Emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically. You just finally matched their distance. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was not defending yourself when they started talking. You heard the whispers, the fake concern, the twisting of truth. They said you changed, said you were acting different, said you weren't the same anymore. They painted you as unstable, moody, difficult, but they never mentioned what they did, never talked about how they forgot you when you needed them, how they only called when they needed something, how they ignored your silence until it became permanent. You could have told your side. You could have listed every moment you were let down, every time you stayed quiet just to keep the peace, every time you held your tongue while your heart was breaking. But you didn't, because you realized the truth didn't matter to them. They didn't want truth. They wanted someone to blame, someone to point at. And you were the easiest target because you weren't talking. That silence was heavy, not empty. It carried everything you never said, all the pain, all the resentment, all the truth. You weren't passive. You were grieving the time you lost trying to fix people who didn't want to be fixed, grieving the parts of yourself you gave away so easily. You thought love meant staying, no matter how much it hurt. You were wrong. Sometimes love means walking away before it destroys you. People think silence is weakness, but it takes strength to shut your mouth when your soul is screaming, to stay quiet when every bone in your body wants to speak, to not throw their betrayals back at them, to not list all the times they failed you. It takes power to not explain yourself to people who never cared enough to ask in the first place. You learned that peace isn't always loud. Sometimes peace is choosing not to fight for space in someone else's narrative. You didn't disappear to get attention. You disappeared to heal. You weren't punishing them. You were saving yourself. Because staying in spaces where you're only valued when you're useful is slow death. And you were tired of dying quietly, tired of carrying weight that wasn't yours, tired of speaking life into people who drained yours in return. So you went silent, not to be missed, but to be free. The silence gave you clarity. You started to see who noticed your absence for real, who called just to check in, who remembered your softness wasn't weakness. That list was shorter than you hoped, but more honest than you expected. You started seeing people for who they really were, not who you wanted them to be, and that hurt. Because sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who never really saw you. Letting people talk was hard. Letting them lie was harder. You wanted to correct them, to clear the air, to remind them of all you did, all the things they forgot on purpose. But your peace became more important than your reputation. You learned the difference between being heard and being understood. You knew they wouldn't understand because they never tried to, and you stopped wasting breath on people who only listened to respond. You stayed quiet. Let them tell their stories. Let them spread their versions. You knew that truth doesn't need defense. Time does that. Patterns expose people. You didn't need to prove anything. You just had to keep moving. Let your silence speak in ways your words never could. Let your absence teach lessons your presence never did. Let the quiet rebuild you while their noise burned itself out. You thought you needed to speak your pain to heal it. But sometimes healing starts when you stop talking, when you let go of needing to be understood, when you accept that not everyone will know what it took to stay soft in a world that kept cutting you. You stopped arguing, stopped convincing, and that silence? It wasn't empty, it was sacred. Some battles aren't meant to be fought with words. Some victories aren't loud. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is leave quietly and never return. You let them think whatever they wanted. Let them fill in the blanks with their assumptions. Because at the end of the day, silence became your answer. And they never expected that. You didn't vanish. You were working, quietly, without updates, without announcements. While they were watching for signs of failure, you were planting. You stopped sharing your progress, not out of fear, but because it wasn't for them anymore. They didn't support the effort. They only noticed the results. So you went silent, and in that silence, you built. Every rejection was repurposed. Every ignored message turned into drive. You learned to stop chasing what didn't respond. You stopped knocking on closed doors, not out of ego, but because you realized some rooms were never meant for you. Not because you weren't good enough, but because you were meant to build your own. So you did. While they thought you were stuck, you were studying patterns, listening more, talking less, watching who disappeared when you stopped performing. You took notes, not to punish, but to prepare. You weren't hiding, you were collecting data. Pain teaches what applause never will. You stopped begging to be seen. You made peace with the shadows, and they gave you clarity. Some days the silence was heavy. No validation, no signs, just effort, repetition, loneliness. But you kept showing up, even when no one clapped, even when no one watched, even when your name was forgotten. You chose discipline over distraction. You chose peace over attention. That's the part no one sees, the hours spent becoming. They thought you were lost, that you'd given up. But you were learning how to be dangerous without being loud. You were practicing, improving, fixing the parts of yourself that used to self-destruct under pressure. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the self-confrontation, the doubt, the fight between the version of you that wanted to quit and the one that refused to stay broken. You kept going, and that changed everything. People don't respect what they can't see. So when you stopped showing your wounds, they assumed you were healed. When you stopped sharing your plans, they assumed you had none. But silence is deceptive. It's not absence, it's intention. You chose not to react, not to respond, not to explain, not because you were weak, but because you had better things to do. You outgrew the need for attention. You no longer found purpose in proving your worth. You found it in creating your own standard. That's what the silence gave you. Space to redefine everything. You started feeding your mind. You read, studied, researched, practiced. You broke habits, challenged your own beliefs, removed distractions. The same people who thought you were wasting time will one day ask how you did it. It wasn't luck. It wasn't overnight. It was consistency without applause. It was doing the hard thing without a witness. It was learning to sit with discomfort without numbing it. You didn't broadcast your failures. You processed them quietly, privately. Then you rebuilt. You took every insult, every disappointment, and stacked them like bricks, not for a wall, but for a throne. They'll never know how much it cost you. The silence was not a pause. It was the work. It was the fire beneath the surface, the stillness before the eruption. People looked at your life and saw calm, but that calm was calculation. You changed the way you moved, less reactive, more intentional. You stopped chasing connections that didn't pour back. You let go of fake loyalty. You made space for growth. It wasn't loud, it wasn't posted, but it was real, and it was yours. They expected you to fade, to break, but you were only becoming harder to read, harder to access, harder to hurt. You trained your mind to ignore noise, to recognize patterns, to see red flags the first time. Your softness didn't die. It transformed. It grew armor. Now kindness comes with conditions. Love comes with boundaries, and your energy is no longer free. People don't understand how dangerous a person becomes once they stop needing validation. You stopped explaining your silence, because it's not a story, it's strategy. It's how you returned to yourself. You stopped asking to be chosen. You chose yourself, repeatedly, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. While they chased visibility, you chased peace. While they flexed, you focused. While they played for attention, you prepared for longevity. That's the difference. You're not here for approval. You're here for mastery. And it doesn't require an audience. It only requires consistency. They'll come back when the numbers show, when the name matters, when the status shifts. But they don't know what you sacrificed in silence. They won't know how many times you cried alone, how many nights you questioned everything, how many mornings you woke up and chose discipline over emotion. That's the part they never see. You don't need to tell them. Your work will, your growth will, your silence will. Let them wonder what changed. Let them ask why you stopped speaking. You didn't need to scream. You just needed time. You didn't seek revenge. You sought progress. Now you have it, and they'll hear it loud and clear, without a word. They thought you gave up. That's the story they told themselves when you went quiet. They didn't ask, didn't check, just assumed. In their minds, silence meant stuck. Paused meant paralyzed. You weren't making noise, so they figured you weren't moving. But they never saw what was happening behind your eyes, behind your breath, behind the stillness. They dismissed. You weren't frozen. You were studying, learning, observing the patterns they couldn't even see in themselves. You were gathering moments, lessons, patterns, people's real intentions, the things they revealed in your absence, the things they said when you weren't around. You stayed still, not because you had no move, but because you were letting theirs play out first. Stillness was necessary. It was your reset, your recovery. You weren't reacting on impulse anymore. You stopped being loud just to be heard. You learned the power of saying nothing, of not explaining, of letting the noise pass over you without engaging. That silence didn't make you weak. It made you clear. Before you reacted fast, you explained too much. You tried to control every narrative. You used to feel like if you didn't respond, you'd lose something, lose people, lose moments, lose relevance. So you used your energy constantly, defending, fixing, clarifying. But all it did was exhaust you, drain you, pull you away from yourself. Then something shifted. You paused, not to retreat, but to reconnect. You had to go quiet to hear your own voice again. The world was loud, so were your thoughts, and you'd been too available to people who were never available for you. So you stepped back, and everything changed. Stillness brought space. Space brought truth. They didn't understand it. They confused your stillness for laziness. They said you lost your spark. You looked unmotivated, detached, but they didn't know you were in the middle of building something real. Internally, spiritually, mentally. You weren't focused on looking active. You were focused on becoming accurate. Stillness doesn't mean nothing's happening. It means everything's happening quietly. You started listening more. You picked up on the energy behind words, the timing of their attention, the inconsistency in their presence. You stopped rushing to give people the benefit of the doubt. You started accepting things as they were, not as you hoped they'd be. Stillness let you breathe. It gave you room to feel the emotions you had buried under busyness. Grief, anger, disappointment, and underneath all of it, clarity. You realized some of the people you missed weren't good for you. Some of the things you were chasing weren't aligned. Some of the goals you thought you wanted were never yours to begin with. Stillness stripped away the noise. It forced honesty. You stopped posting just to be seen, stopped responding just to be liked, stopped showing up where you weren't respected. You didn't owe anyone your presence. You didn't need to prove your worth anymore. The still version of you had no desire to perform. You weren't interested in applause. You were interested in peace, and peace is quiet. They tried to provoke you, tried to bait you with drama, tried to remind you of who you used to be, the emotional version of you, the triggered one, the reactive one. But you didn't bite. Not this time. You just let them talk, let them spin their stories. You didn't need to correct lies. You didn't need to be in the room where they were misrepresenting your name. You trusted time to do the explaining. You trusted consistency to speak for you. There's strength in not reacting. It's not apathy. It's discipline, the kind of control that only comes from pain. You had to be pushed to that edge, had to be torn down by your own need to be understood. And when you finally let go of that need, you gained power. You started responding instead of reacting. And your responses weren't loud. They were strategic, measured, intentional. You became quieter, but sharper. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was calculation. Stillness became your filter. It taught you what deserved your energy and what didn't. You realized not every message needs a reply. Not every invitation needs acceptance. Not every disrespect needs confrontation. Some things need to be left unanswered so people can sit with their own noise. Stillness made you dangerous because while they thought you were fading, you were rising without announcing it, without seeking approval. While they filled rooms with talk, you were in your own space building skills. While they posted, you planned. While they debated, you executed. And now they're confused, wondering how you got here, how you stayed calm while everything around you moved in chaos. You didn't stop. You just stopped reacting to things that weren't worth it. You didn't give up. You just stopped giving energy to cycles that never led anywhere. You still cared. You just redirected your care inward, into your growth, your focus, your peace. They said you changed. You didn't argue, because they were right. You did. And it happened quietly. While they were busy trying to be loud, you were becoming solid, steady, rooted. Your stillness gave birth to a version of you that moves different, not rushed, not impulsive, just with certainty. And that's the difference. You weren't stuck. You were still. And stillness is power, the kind they never saw coming. Silence became the filter. The more you stopped talking, the more you started seeing. Without the noise, without the distractions, things got clearer. You began to notice who went quiet with you, who stopped calling when you stopped initiating, who vanished when you stopped pouring energy into dead spaces. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, just a slow realization, one person at a time. No arguments, no fallouts, just space. And the space revealed the truth. You thought they cared. You thought the bond was mutual. But then you went quiet, and they never reached out. They didn't notice the change. Or maybe they noticed and didn't care. Either way, their silence said more than their words ever did. It hurt. Not all at once, but gradually, like an echo fading. You waited for a text that never came, a call that was never dialed, and when you realized it wasn't coming, it didn't even surprise you. It just confirmed what your gut had been whispering. There were people you thought would always check in, people you had been there for, at their lowest, at their most chaotic. You had shown up when it was inconvenient, when it cost you time, energy, sleep. You were the one they vented to, cried to, leaned on, but the second your energy shifted, they were gone. Not a word, not a "how are you?" Just silence. That was the first wave of clarity. It didn't break you. It freed you. Silence shows you who's listening when you're not speaking, who feels your absence when you're not performing. It strips away the illusion, the surface-level loyalty, the convenience-based friendships. It shines a light on where your time went, on who only stayed because you kept giving. Once you stopped, they stopped too. But real ones, they noticed, they called, they asked if you were okay. And they didn't need an explanation. They just knew. Your silence became a mirror. You started seeing your own patterns, how often you overextended, how quickly you said yes, how rarely you asked for anything in return. You remembered the times you brushed off your own needs to make others feel safe, how you felt guilty for resting, how you apologized for saying no. And in the quiet, it became obvious. You weren't just drained, you were surrounded by people who mistook your kindness for default. You started remembering things, the way certain people only called you when they were bored, the ones who disappeared when they got what they needed, the ones who only showed up when the room was lit and the applause was loud. You realized you weren't crazy. You weren't overthinking. You were finally listening to your intuition. You had ignored it for too long. Now, it was screaming through the silence. Some of them came back later, with excuses, with half-hearted check-ins. But by then, you weren't interested. Not because you were angry, but because you were done pretending. You couldn't unsee what you saw in the silence, the patterns, the disinterest, the truth that some people only loved the version of you that served them, the one who always said yes, the one who never asked for anything. That version is gone. You didn't owe them a response or an explanation. You didn't need to have a conversation about it. You had the conversation with yourself, and that was enough. Clarity doesn't require closure. Sometimes the absence is the closure. When someone goes quiet after you stop giving, that's your answer. That's the pattern. You don't need to analyze it. You just need to believe it. And in all that quiet, something shifted inside you. You stopped expecting loyalty from people who never earned it. You stopped romanticizing one-sided relationships. You stopped confusing attention with affection. The silence gave you space to unlearn, to reset, to revalue yourself. And as painful as it was, you knew it had to happen, because you couldn't keep leaking energy into people who weren't even trying to refill you. You remembered who did show up, maybe just one or two, the ones who didn't need reminders, who felt your absence before you even explained it, who didn't ask for a version of you. They just wanted you. Those people you keep, you protect, you never take for granted. Because in the silence, their voices were the only ones that felt safe. You started speaking differently, not louder, just less often, with more intention. Your circle got smaller, quieter, but more real. You didn't need crowds. You needed consistency. You didn't need noise. You needed peace. You realized how much time you had wasted trying to prove your worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. That era ended with the silence. Now when someone disappears, you don't chase. When someone stops checking in, you don't overthink. When energy shifts, you don't beg for clarity. You already have it. You know who's genuine, who's performative, who's seasonal. You let people show themselves, and when they do, you believe it. That's what silence taught you. To stop guessing, to stop fixing, to stop giving people more chances than they gave you care. The silence didn't change you. It revealed you. It returned you to yourself. And that's the kind of clarity no one can take away. You're not the same anymore. And it's not something you say to sound strong. It's something you live. You feel it in your bones, in the way your silence now speaks louder than your old words ever could. You used to explain every emotion, every decision, every small shift in your mood. You thought communication would save your relationships. You thought honesty would protect you, but it didn't. It only gave people maps to your weakness, and they used them. They expect you to come back as the version of you that always showed up, that dropped everything when someone needed reassurance, that stayed up late comforting people who would never do the same. They want the version who over-explained, over-apologized, overcompensated. But that version is gone. You didn't just change. You were forced to. You had to, because staying soft in a place that only hardened you was emotional suicide. Now you pause before speaking, not because you're unsure, but because you don't need to prove anything. You've stopped over-clarifying your value. If they don't see it, that's not your problem. You've learned that some people only listen to argue, only watch to judge. So you stopped giving them anything to use. You still speak, but only when it's necessary. And when you do, it hits different, because it comes from clarity, not emotion. They don't understand this version of you. They miss the one who laughed at things that weren't funny, who said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, who made peace just to avoid conflict. Now you choose silence over forced connections. Now you walk away when you feel disrespected. No yelling, no warnings, just absence. And that unsettles them more than your presence ever did. They ask if something's wrong. You say no, because explaining would only serve them, not you. And if they didn't notice the 1,000 small changes before the silence, they don't deserve the reason for it now. You grew quietly while they stayed comfortable. You were hurting while they were laughing. You were rebuilding while they were forgetting. And now they feel the gap, not because you're distant, but because you're different. Your time is measured now. Your energy is selective. You don't entertain drama. You don't chase closeness. You don't text first, not out of ego, out of experience. You've learned that people show you exactly who they are when you stop feeding their needs, when you stop being convenient. That's when the truth shows up. You saw it, you accepted it, and then you acted on it. People miss who you were, but that version of you was bleeding. That version cried behind closed doors. That version made excuses for behavior that should have been cut off instantly. You don't wear that skin anymore. You outgrew it. Your silence is your upgrade. Your calm is your protection. Your distance is your boundary. They don't know the nights you stayed quiet when you wanted to scream. They don't know the conversations you had with yourself at 2 a.m. just to not break apart. They only see the current you and say you've changed, but they weren't there for the breaking. They don't get to comment on the rebuilding. You move differently now. You don't share your goals. You don't announce your plans. You let things unfold in silence. You learned that not everyone clapping is rooting for you. Some are just curious. Some are waiting for you to fail. And you failed before, publicly, painfully, but it made you smarter. Now you let your actions speak. You let your peace confuse them. You smile less, but mean it more. You talk less, but your presence says enough. You don't rush to fix what isn't yours to fix. You no longer carry the weight of one-sided loyalty. That person they expect you to be, naive, forgiving, always reachable, is gone. And what replaced them isn't bitter. It's balanced, unapologetically balanced. They think silence is distance, but silence is survival. It's space, it's reflection. You're not lost. You're just protecting what's left of you. The healed parts, the parts you had to fight for. You don't give those away freely anymore. You've earned them, and you keep them close. Some people only loved the version of you that was easy to manipulate, the version that didn't ask for more, that said yes every time, that believed in potential over patterns, that hoped even when the proof was screaming no. That version couldn't survive forever. It was fragile. Honest but fragile. And this world doesn't protect fragility. It uses it. You used to be predictable. Now you're unreadable. You used to fill silence with words. Now you let it sit. Let it stretch. Let it show you what's real. You can read energy now. Catch tone shifts. Spot inconsistency. You pay attention to what's not being said. And that awareness keeps you safe. They don't like this version of you because it doesn't benefit them. It doesn't bend. It doesn't explain. It doesn't chase. But it's not your job to make people comfortable with your growth. You don't shrink anymore. You stand where you are. Silent, observant, intact. You're not cold. You're clear, not distant. Just unavailable to chaos. You haven't lost love. You've just stopped proving it to the wrong people. You're no longer accessible to those who only valued you when you were breaking yourself for them. Let them talk. Let them guess. Let them say you've changed. You have. And the silence they think is distance is actually your discipline. You're not the same anymore. And thank God for that. You don't move the way you used to. That version of you, the one that explained everything, over-apologized, softened yourself to make others comfortable, is gone. People notice. They feel the difference, even if they don't know how to describe it. You're not louder. You're just more intentional. You don't ask if they're okay with your boundaries anymore. You set them and walk away from whoever can't respect them. That alone unsettles them more than your silence ever could. There was a time when you were easy to read, always available, always the one to reach out first. You made people feel safe, not because they earned it, but because you offered safety like it was free. You used to think your worth came from how much you could give, how much you could fix. But you were bleeding out in the process. People praised your kindness while silently abusing it. You didn't speak on it. You just let them take and take and take. Now they don't get that version anymore. Now you say less, respond less, share less. Some think you've changed. Others think you're acting different. But you know it's not acting. It's becoming. You grew into someone who finally knows their limits, who finally chooses peace over pleasing. And they hate that, because they lost control the second you gained clarity. They used to expect access, immediate answers, emotional labor on demand. They knew you wouldn't say no, knew you'd twist yourself to avoid conflict, but then you stopped, quietly, no announcement, no breakdown, just distance. Now your silence feels like punishment to them, but it's not. It's protection for you. You've changed in ways they can't see. You observe more. You wait before reacting. You listen to tone, not just words. You look for effort, not excuses. They think you're cold because you don't entertain what drains you anymore. They think you're cruel because you don't return to familiar pain. But you know better. You know what it took to get here. They confuse your stillness for stubbornness. They call your silence ego. But they forget how many times you bit your tongue just to keep peace. How often you apologized when you weren't wrong. How many times you showed up for people who never once showed up for you. They only remember your absence now, not the 100 times you were present when they didn't deserve it. You used to beg to be understood. Now you don't care. You used to explain your every move. Now you let them assume, and they do. They create their own stories to feel better. Because facing the truth means admitting they lost someone who was good to them. Someone who would have stayed if only they had shown up when it mattered. They don't see the hours you spent learning how to stop overthinking. How you retrained your mind not to chase people. How you learned to sleep at night without closure. They didn't see the days when silence was unbearable, when you had to talk yourself out of sending that text, making that call, reaching out just one more time. You didn't disappear. You rebuilt, quietly, carefully, brick by brick. There's a kind of strength that comes from being alone with your thoughts long enough. You start noticing the patterns you used to ignore. You stop romanticizing effort that only ever came from your side. You stop making excuses for people who had every chance but chose indifference. Your tolerance shrinks, but your standards rise. You stop participating in one-sided relationships, and that shift scares people. They try to pull you back into the role you used to play, the always there one, the fixer, the forgiver. But you're not that anymore. You don't respond to guilt trips. You don't open old doors. You don't explain your silence, because you know now that some people only value your voice when it serves them. And when it doesn't, they call it attitude, call it bitterness, call it being difficult. But you're not bitter. You're focused. You're selective. You're done allowing people to exhaust you and then call you selfish when you rest. You've learned the difference between being a good person and being used. You've learned that not everyone who says "I'm here for you" means it. Now you wait. You watch. You move different. Not with revenge, not with rage, just with clarity. You've become a version of yourself that doesn't need applause, doesn't need to be understood, doesn't chase peace. You are peace. Your silence speaks louder than anything you could say now. They feel it when they don't hear from you. They remember your name in rooms they didn't invite you into. They wonder what you're thinking, what you're building, who you've become. And the truth is, you've become everything they never expected, everything they couldn't handle. This new version of you doesn't argue, doesn't prove, doesn't explain. You don't need to. You already did all that. You outgrew people who loved you when you were unsure of yourself. They don't know how to connect to this version, the one who chooses peace over chaos, self-worth over people-pleasing, boundaries over burnout. They used to think silence was weakness. Now they feel the power in it. They used to expect access. Now they get distance. You're not angry. You're not loud. You're just unavailable. And that is the most powerful shift of all.